From the very first moment it became evident, and the Queen made no secret of it, that Mary Stuart intended to resent the foul murder of one who, if he had not been her lover, had enjoyed her confidence and her friendship, and whom not even her personal intercession had been able to save from a most cruel and entirely undeserved death. Immediately after the murder, when Ruthven came back to her presence with the blood-stained dagger still in his hand and demanded wine, she answered, "It shall be dear blood to some of you." The conspirators were not satisfied with having slain Rizio. His murder was only the unavoidable means to accomplish a certain purpose, to get control of the government. They kept the Queen in close captivity and would not permit any of her friends, not even her ladies, to see or confer with her. It was then that Mary resorted to her great power of duplicity. Carefully concealing the profound horror and disgust with which the sight of Darnley filled her, she convinced him easily that her interests and his were identical, that his strength lay in his exalted station as consort of the Queen. Darnley was only too easily persuaded. He fell readily into the trap which the deceitful Queen had set for him. Carried away by her tenderness and loveliness, he promised to release her from her captivity and to abduct her to Dunbar Castle. Darnley induced a number of his personal friends and adherents to join him in this undertaking, and a few nights later the flight from Holyrood to Dunbar was effected with complete success. Darnley, after having thus separated his cause from that of the enemies of the Queen, who were seriously debating whether she should be imprisoned for life, exiled from the country, or put to death, went a step further. He openly denounced the assassination of Rizzio as an inexcusable crime, and disclaimed all previous knowledge of and complicity in it. Nobody believed him, neither the Queen, who had seen his active participation in the murder when he could easily have prevented it, nor the conspirators, who knew that he had planned all the details, had helped in its execution, and had promised to protect those who would take a hand in it. But Darnley's lying declaration served the political aims of the Queen well. From Dunbar she issued an appeal to the loyal people and nobles of Scotland, imploring their assistance against the rebels who had driven her from Edinburgh and had insulted and threatened her in her own palace, and using the presence and the declaration of the King to contradict the stories and accusations circulated by the conspirators and rebels against her scandalous private life. 8,000 loyal Scots responded to this appeal of their Queen, and at the head of this enthusiastic army, Queen Mary and her husband returned to Edinburgh and once more took possession of Holyrood. It was not long before the Queen threw off the mask of affection for Darnley, which she had assumed for political purposes, and openly again showed that aversion which she really felt for him. Not even the birth of her son, who afterwards as James VI ruled over Scotland, and as James I over England, changed the strained relations between husband and wife. There seems to be no doubt that the new cause of these strained relations, which grew more apparent from day to day, was a criminal and adulterous love affair, which had quite suddenly sprung up between the Queen and one of the noblemen of her court, the Earl of Bothwell. The new favourite was a scion of one of the noblest and most renowned families of Scotland, but his personal history was far from being honourable. Bothwell was at that time no longer a young man. When quite young, he had one day disappeared from the castle of his fathers, and on reaching the coast of the North Sea, had joined a gang of adventurers who, as pirates, infested those waters and were a terror to the merchant vessels of all the nations of Europe. By natural ability, unbounded courage and daring, the young Scotchman had rapidly risen to a commanding position among the wild corsairs. His name was repeated with fear and awe from the coasts of Denmark to the west coast of Ireland. In one of the desperate engagements with warships of the Hanseatic League, he had lost one eye, but had saved his life and his freedom. Many years of his life he had passed in this wild and adventurous career. Then the news of the death of his father reached him, and one morning he reappeared in his ancestral home to take possession of his vast domain. The turbulent condition of Scotland, the civil war between Protestants and Catholics, the struggles for supremacy between the crown and the nobility, were congenial to his adventurous and reckless spirit. He had been among the first to greet Mary Stuart on her arrival from France, and had shown her from the first day he saw her an enthusiastic, almost worshipful devotion. He was a passionate adorer of female beauty, and the romantic halo of his past life which surrounded his brow had secured for him triumphs in love affairs with some of the fairest women of the court. He was among those who escorted Mary from Holyrood to Dunbar, and again he was one of those who led her back in triumph from Dunbar to Edinburgh. During this return march, Bothwell distinguished himself by the skill of his military dispositions, by his boldness and intrepidity, and attracted the personal notice of the Queen. At Holyrood, the acquaintance between the Queen and the daring general quickly ripened into love and intimacy, although the Queen took great care at first to conceal the new passion which had taken possession of her inflammable heart, even from her closest friends. But while these efforts on the part of the Queen may have been successful in deceiving her intimate friends, there were always eyes turned upon her which were not so easily deceived, and these eyes were those of the ambassadors of England, France, and Spain accredited at her court. They watched her conduct very attentively and almost simultaneously reported to their sovereigns the nascent favour with which the Queen looked upon Bothwell and the growing coldness which became noticeable between her and Darnley. It was only a serious accident, which befell Bothwell soon afterwards, and which imperilled his life for several days, that revealed the new passion of the Queen to the whole court, and placed the new favourite at the head of the government, with similar honours and similar powers to those previously showered on Rizio. We have reached the period when Mary, blinded by passion and infatuated with love for a man utterly unworthy of her, or to speak more correctly, of the exalted position she occupied in the world, surrendered not only herself, but also the dignity of the crown and the honour and the interests of the realm to the Earl of Bothwell, known to the entire court as a profligate and libertine of the worst sort and as a most unscrupulous and reckless adventurer. It was this infatuation for Bothwell and the shameless liaison she formed with him, from which all of Queen Mary's sufferings and disasters now flowed in rapid succession. Not even her incomparable beauty and loveliness could save her from the contempt attached to this disgraceful liaison, of which she made soon no more a secret than she had formerly made of her preference for Rizzio. But while in her infatuation for the Italian singer, the artistic taste of the Queen was rather successfully used by her admirers as an excuse for her enthusiastic preference for him, there was absolutely no excuse for her liaison with Bothwell, and Bothwell did all he could do to strengthen the unfavourable impression of Mary's conduct by the haughty and overbearing rudeness with which he treated the greatest lords and the highest dignitaries of the kingdom, including the king himself, for whom he openly showed the greatest contempt. Outraged by the insults which he had to endure day after day and from which the Queen herself did not seem to be willing to protect him, Darnley suddenly left the court and went to Glasgow, where he took up his residence in the house of his father, the Earl of Lennox. The king's sudden departure caused more unfavourable comment than the Queen had anticipated. It greatly disconcerted her, because she was afraid that from Glasgow Darnley might issue an appeal to the Scotch people, and especially to the dissatisfied nobility, laying before them his complaints and calling upon them to overthrow the disgraceful rule of an adulterous wife and her paramour. Soon the news came from Glasgow that Darnley had fallen seriously ill, that he was suffering from the smallpox and was expected to die. The Queen took advantage of this serious illness and once more resorted to her power of dissimulation, which had served her so well after Rizzio's death. She intended now to employ it not only to temporarily deceive and beguile her husband, but to decoy him into an ambush and put him to death. Incredible as the enormity and ferocity of the crime may appear, especially on the part of a young and beautiful woman distinguished by so many mental advantages, there seems not to be the least doubt that Mary, in going to Glasgow and appearing at the bedside of her sick husband as a loving wife, had this horrid crime in view and successfully paved the way for its execution. She again played with consummate art the part of a loving and trembling wife, and deceived Darnley so fully that he promised to follow her to Edinburgh as soon as the progress of his convalescence would make it possible for him to undertake the journey. Thus fully assured of Darnley's forgiveness, she returned to Holyrood and perfected there, together with Bothwell, the arrangements for his murder. When Darnley arrived at Edinburgh, a short time afterwards, he was not, as he ought to have been, taken to the royal palace, where he could have been cared for better than anywhere else, but to a private residence in an isolated location in one of the suburbs of the city, whose salubrious location, it was alleged, would facilitate the king's rapid recovery. Darnley himself was greatly surprised at these arrangements, especially when he learned that the Queen would not take up her residence with him, but would remain at the palace. Apprehensions of some impending danger haunted his mind, and he became melancholy and despondent. However, the Queen, by her appearance and the excess of her tenderness, soon dispelled his vague fears, and convinced him that only care for his enfeebled condition and the hope of quickening his convalescence had prompted her to select his residence, from which he would be promptly removed after his complete recovery. In order to reassure him fully, she remained several nights with him, occupying a room immediately beneath his own and manifesting toward him the greatest affection and solicitude. One of her pages slept in the same room with him, and 5 or 6 servants whom Bothwell had appointed formed the entire household. Late in the evening of February 9, 1567, the Queen left the house and went back to Holyrood to pass the night there, because one of the musicians attached to the royal chapel was to be married that night, and she had promised to be at the wedding. It was while the wedding festivities were going on at Holyrood, and while the Queen was dancing with some of the courtiers in the most careless and unaffected manner possible, that a terrific explosion took place which was heard and felt in all parts of the city and at Holyrood. Soon the rumor spread that the house of the king had been blown to atoms and that all the inmates were buried under the ruins. This rumor was only partly true. The morning light of the 10th of February revealed the fact that the house had been blown up by means of an underground mine, but the corpse of the king was not found among the ruins. On the contrary, it was found together with the corpse of the page in an orchard adjoining the house, and neither the king nor the page showed any marks of gunpowder. But the bloated condition of their faces and the marks of fingernails on their necks showed that both had been choked to death and had been left lying on the ground where the assassins had killed them. It was then surmised that both the king and the page, having been disturbed in their sleep by the approach of the assassins, had tried to make their escape through the orchard, but had been overtaken in their flight and slain. The explosion had unquestionably been intended to destroy all vestiges of the crime by burying both the assassins and their victims under the ruins, but it had either taken place too soon, before the murderers could have carried the king and the page back to the house, or the assassins had hurried away immediately after committing the deed. At all events, Darnley was dead. The evidences of premeditated murder were so plain that from the very first, not the least doubt was manifested as to the character of the calamity. Neither was there the least uncertainty in the public mind as to the author or authors of the terrible catastrophe and the assassinations attending it. The public voice immediately named Bothwell as the murderer and added in a whisper the name of the Queen as his accomplice. In those times, murders were committed so often that the murderers in a majority of cases escaped unpunished. But in this case, the rank of the victim was so exalted, and moreover, the circumstances surrounding the crime were so damaging to the authority of the crown that public opinion demanding an investigation of the death of the king could not be disregarded. The Queen, who if innocent should have been the first to insist on a thorough investigation of the crime by which her husband was killed, affected an absolute indifference in the matter. She utterly disregarded the damaging rumors which openly charged Bothwell with the murder, and by this indifference confirmed the suspicion of her silent active, or at best passive, participation in the crime. The Queen even openly defied public opinion by leaving Bothwell in the undisturbed possession of the honors and dignities she had conferred upon him, and by adding new ones, showing the continued favor the Earl enjoyed in spite of the public clamor raised against him. But Banquo's ghost would not go down. The excitement and the indignation of the people rose to the highest point. On her appearance in the streets, the Queen was insulted by the women. She found it necessary for her safety to leave Holyrood and seek refuge in the fortified castle. Bothwell had the audacity to demand a public trial because the Earl of Lennox, Darnley's father, had openly accused him of the murder, and the cowardly judges, overawed by the power of the accused, by the royal troops, by the authority of the Queen, acquitted him, while the whole people considered and declared him guilty. We have reached the end of this atrocious murder. Posterity holds Queen Mary guilty of the crime of having murdered her young husband. Mary's long imprisonment and final execution at the bidding of a cruel and jealous rival has often been deplored by biographer, historian, and dramatist, but perhaps they are a just atonement for crimes as atrocious as they were unprecedented.